Do games have to be fun? When it comes to other mediums, this question is easily answered, and I think pretty much anyone would agree that not all films, not all books, not all music is designed with fun or simple entertainment in mind, and nor should they be. If the purpose of art is to reflect the human experience in some way, then it's only fair and natural that the more complex, negative, or tender aspects of that experience are represented too. In fact, generally speaking, the films that win awards are usually not the ones that make the judges laugh or thrill them with cheap stunts. They're the ones that explore human relationships in a way that resonates and stays with their viewers long after watching. While it may not necessarily be pleasant to read a book with distressing subject matter or listen to a song that stirs complicated emotions, there can be a certain gratification and catharsis that comes from it, a reminder that you're not alone in experiencing those feelings, and that others have been moved by them strongly enough to create art based on them. And just to be clear, because I know somebody just started typing out an angry comment calling me an elitist, this is not to say that something designed to be a purely entertaining experience is bad or inferior. The entertainment value of an unpretentious B-movie from decades past is undeniable, and when a film like that knows exactly what it is and leans into it confidently, that unpretentiousness can become a refreshing quality all of its own. As I said, however, you're not likely to see one of these films on an award show outside of the Golden Raspberries. Does that invalidate the enjoyment you get from them? Of course not. But I think it demonstrates a general consensus that the art our culture celebrates most highly should at the very least be striving for higher ambitions than simple amusement, enjoyment, or pleasure. And so, to turn to the medium that I've spent more time with than any other, it's a little odd that games seem to be the exception here, and are often expected to live up to some level of gaminess, that is to say, fun, to justify their own existence. An aphorism that I occasionally see chucked about is that games don't need to be fun in the same way that food doesn't need to taste good, which is a nice attempt at a slam dunk analogy, but in case it isn't obvious by now, I don't agree. Clearly, a meal that was deliberately designed to taste bad would be subversive to the point of incomprehensibility, like a film being projected onto the wall behind you. Or perhaps an equivalent analogy would be a game that plays itself, at which point the interactivity that defines the medium would dissolve into meaninglessness. But assuming the player still retains some level of control, there's surely no reason why a game can't throw fun out the window and instead aim to bring out feelings of grief, anxiety, shame, or any other negative sensation you can think of, without losing its claim to gamehood. So what's the controversy here? Why are games so often shackled to a hedonic standard that other mediums have long since shaken off? Part of the answer must surely be that games are still in their infancy, relatively speaking, with only 1.5-ish generations of human beings having had a chance to influence or be influenced by them. That's an excuse that only goes so far though. Everything under the sun is new for a while, until it isn't, and games are already a multi-billion-dollar industry, eclipsing publishing, music and Hollywood many times over. So perhaps there's something inherent to the interactive medium of games that causes them to drift towards this pleasure principle. Reading a book, or especially watching a film that deals with uncomfortable subject matter, is a mostly passive affair. Even if it takes an emotional toll, it's usually easy to continue without switching it off. The interactive element unique to games, however, means that the player has to, by necessity, take an active role in advancing things, choosing every second to keep going. And an experience that asks you to willfully advance into further discomfort is a much harder sell. After all, what sane person would knowingly want to take part in 15 hours of misery, suffering, and relentless attack on their faith in humanity? Which reminds me, this video is supposed to be about Lisa. If there's one game or series that comes to mind for me before any other when musing on the topic of games needing to be fun, it's this one. Despite its goofy presentation, this is a series that does not pull any punches when it comes to dark subject matter, and I really do mean very dark. This isn't a game where mature is a juvenile code word for sex and violence, though both are still present in copious amounts. When I say mature here, what I mean is that there are some seriously heavy themes in these games, about the very worst kinds of abuse human beings can inflict on each other. In order to do this story justice, I think it's only right that I don't shy away from those themes in this video, so just be warned of what's coming, and do with that warning what you will. So okay, that's all well and good. The story and setting are dark and depressing. But there are countless films, graphic novels, and books that can say the same. What sets Lisa apart as an interactive game that makes it into a painful experience deserving of its very literal subtitle? Well, that's the really interesting question here that makes Lisa a fascinating topic of discussion, and that I'm bringing up more than 5 minutes into the video. Give yourself a pat on the back for your attention span if you've made it this far. To put it simply, Lisa just doesn't care if you're having fun or not. It doesn't care if you have to waste time grinding, it doesn't care if you have to repeat entire sections over and over again, and it definitely doesn't care if you just lost an hour of progress because of some bad RNG. In fact, this is a game that absolutely delights in wasting your time, and it's quite upfront and honest about that. But if you just want to have your time wasted, then there's no end of AAA slop games that are more than happy to provide you with countless hours of vapid, copy-pasted content while your eyes glaze over and your chest gets damp with your own drool. Clearly, Lisa is aiming to be a higher order of experience than that, to make you think just a little bit more about what you're doing, and to decide for yourself whether any potential payoff could possibly be worth the grueling slog this game will put you through. And then to decide afterwards whether you actually got any kind of catharsis or relief from it after all. Without giving too much away, if there is any payoff to be had from sticking it out to the end of Lisa, then I think it's safe to say that it's in the narrative and not in the gameplay. This is very much a game that requires some level of investment in the plot to keep you going through its more frustrating moments. And now that I've said all I can say without ruining the experience for you, it's time for you to make the call on whether or not you're going to play Lisa for yourself before watching further. If you're intrigued by anything I've said so far, or if you have an interest in games that are concerned with more than merely entertaining the player, then I'd say it's worth going in blind and finding out just how patient you can be in the name of experiencing something unique. There will be spoilers from here. So in my introduction just now, I flip-flopped quite freely between referring to Lisa as a game and as a series. That's because while there are 3 games here with different subtitles and main characters, I think it's fair enough to say that they sort of come as one package and one grand experience. At least, I find it very difficult to imagine a player being committed enough to get to the end of one of these games without then playing the other 2, hopefully in order. Also worth mentioning early on is that Lisa was made entirely by a single developer, Austin Jorgensen, and I think that goes some way towards explaining the game's idiosyncratic nature. More on that later, but for now just keep it in mind as we take our first step into Lisa's world. Lisa the First is a self-confessed Yume Nikki ripoff that throws you into the psyche of a young girl, the eponymous Lisa, struggling in vain to get away from her physically abusive father. And I mean, it pretty much sets the tone for everything that comes after. Don't come at me later on saying I didn't warn you. For the Zoomers in the room who don't know what Yume Nikki is, what you do in Lisa the First is walk around until you find a key item, then keep walking around until you stumble into the place you're supposed to use it. Rinse and repeat while taking in surreal, suggestive, and occasionally explicit imagery that puts you in an anxious and possibly nauseated state of mind. It takes a little over an hour to play, and the majority of that time will be spent walking back and forth across the same areas, trying to figure out which single NPC you missed talking to get the item or key you need. That's a superficial description, but not an inaccurate one, and I doubt the dev would disagree with me here. The gameplay of Lisa the First is superficial, but it's also quite obviously not the focus of the experience. The closest it comes to something like traditional gameplay with enemies and fail states is in a couple of maze-like sections where you need to avoid being caught by spiders with the head of Lisa's abusive father, Marty. Remember that name. These sections are simple enough that they don't offer much in the way of challenge, and like everything else in Lisa the First, are almost certainly here for metaphorical or emotional effect. So on that topic, how does this game get you into the desired frame of mind, dreading the discomfort of what's around the corner but unable to look away? A lot of the heavy lifting here is done by the visuals, which are ugly in that peculiar and original way that makes you want to see more. The floors and walls of buildings are dripping with bile, vomit, and who knows what fluids. You can almost smell some of these rooms just by looking at them. Grotesque, mutated manifestations of Marty befoul the world with their presence, with nothing to say for themselves besides an inarticulate howl. The symbolism of turning an abusive father into a disgusting and inescapable monster is obvious enough to need no explanation, but there are elements that are a bit more open to interpretation. The bar full of reveling Martys points towards alcoholism and addiction, a circumstance that's highly correlated with abuse and that we certainly haven't seen the last of in this series. The golden cross is a symbol that appears repeatedly as well, perhaps most strikingly in this room surrounded by deformed Martys. This room serves no purpose to progression or gameplay, but for those looking for something to read into, it surely offers fertile ground. Perhaps Marty cloaks his abuse of his daughter in the veil of religious faith or righteousness, a common enough trope in fiction and sadly all too real in our world as well. This interpretation would cause the crosses that serve as safe checkpoints for Lisa while navigating the spider mazes to take on a darkly ironic twist. You might say I'm reaching here, and naturally we can never know exactly what was going through the developer's head when he made these choices. I doubt even he could tell you now, a decade after the fact. But when analysing something as metaphorical and allegorical as Lisa, I think we need to give the author's creative process enough credit to assume that the imagery used in the game was placed there with purpose and not at random. Perhaps the most horrifying figure in Lisa I is the recurrent NPC who calls himself Tricky Rick and seems to personify a part of Marty's anatomy. He's the character who most explicitly refers to the abuse that the game is really about, and is usually encountered at the end of a maze or ordeal of some kind, which I think suggests some attempt at repression on Lisa's part of the overwhelming despair and helplessness that he inspires. The idea of a young girl creating this character in her mind in a futile attempt to rationalize her never-ending trauma is an incredibly discomforting one, and without a doubt it's the thing that stayed with me the most from this part of the trilogy. Reaching the ending requires killing him in a number of ways with some of the key items you get while exploring, presumably playing out Lisa's fruitless fantasies of stopping her torment. And then, in case you were in any doubt, the actual conclusion hammers home that there is no relief and certainly no happy ending. Some scars are deep enough to leave their mark forever, and the damage left behind is inescapable no matter how much you run. The final image of an endless field of pink Martys that remains unchanging no matter how much you move across it makes that unmistakably clear. It's not a pleasant or uplifting ending, but then of course it's not supposed to be. So what are we to make of the uncomfortable, bleak, and deeply personal experience that is Lisa I? Clearly it's a game all about anguish, pain, and trauma, about wanting to overcome it and being completely unable to. A younger person playing this game without much exposure to the darker realities of the world might simply come away confused, mildly disgusted, and more than a little bit bored. But if you're looking for it, or perhaps more accurately, if you have the life experience to know what to look for, then Lisa I can be a profoundly relatable work of art. Will you have fun playing it? Well, no, obviously not. Will you ever want to play it again? Unlikely. But it's an experience that might just stick with you and expand your conception of what kinds of subject matter can be approached via the medium of games, and what kind of feelings they can aim to bring out of the player interacting with them. And being an interactive experience, Lisa I is able to inflict frustration, despair, and suffering on the player in a way that's not quite possible in books, music, or film. Whether you think this is a good or desirable thing is for you to decide. The philosophy of Lisa, and I presume of its creator as well, can be best summarized with the following snippet of gameplay. At the central hub from which you access the game's different areas, one of the paths is up a rope, and as you climb, it keeps going up and up, and alone with your thoughts for 20-ish seconds, all you can do is keep climbing, wonder what's going to be at the top, and silence the nagging voice in your head that's questioning what you're choosing to do with your precious time. And when you finally reach the top, it's nothing. Worse than nothing, in fact, because if there was nothing here, then you might just think that you're missing an item or trigger and need to come back later. Instead, by showing you its middle finger, the game leaves you in no doubt whatsoever that you just wasted your time for no reason. Quite the metaphor, and certainly one that could only take place in an interactive game where the player is in control. This is a trick so nice, the developer used it thrice, once in each Lisa game. There's a lot more to be said on this, but I think it's better saved for later after digging into the more well-known and approachable parts of the Lisa saga. After all, Lisa I is a relatively quick experience that can be completed in less time than the average film. But if we take its pessimistic outlook and stretch it out for 12 hours, the results are bound to be even more interesting. Lisa the Painful is a far more traditional game than its predecessor, at least on the surface. It's got health points, leveling up, skills, currency, status effects, random encounters, an equipment screen, a huge number of party members to recruit, and a combat system of surprising depth that will see you devising strategies and building your squad around their complementary abilities. It seems to be about as far a cry from Lisa the First as it's possible to be, and this extends to the setting as well. If the first takes place entirely inside the mind of a traumatized child, then The Painful shows us what kind of a sick and twisted world existing outside that mind could let something like that happen. Lisa the Painful takes place in Olathe, a recently post-apocalyptic wasteland where all women have died off, leaving only men to fight over the scraps, kill each other for sport, and, well, amuse themselves with other pastimes. I mean, if you were faced with the certainty that you were in the final generation of mankind, what would you do? The commodity everyone wants, and that now passes for currency, is dirty magazines. A little blue pill called Joy helps its users numb themselves to the overwhelming hopelessness of their situation, but indulging the addiction for too long results in them Cronenberging into joy mutants, mindless body horrors of assorted shape and size who usually serve as dangerous mini-bosses when the player's venturing into new areas. Exploitation, abuse, neglect, addiction, mutilation, these are all everyday occurrences in the world of Lisa. This is not a story for the faint-hearted, and there's no question that humanity is doomed in this tale. All of this makes for an appropriately bleak and morbid backdrop for an experience that's all about pain, and to the game's credit, some of this bleakness finds its way into the gameplay as well. If I tell you that one of the most commonly inflicted status ailments in this game is crying, then I think you'll get the picture. On the more mechanical side, some party members that join you will be joy addicts, and will suffer withdrawal effects that tank their stats and turn them into a liability if you don't feed them their fix. I actually think the game could have gone a lot further with this, but I'm getting ahead of myself. One such joy addict is the protagonist of Lisa the Painful, Brad Armstrong, brother of the Lisa from the previous game, though depending on how perceptive the player is, this might not be fully clear until several hours in. The abuse that he and his sister suffered happened before this game's apocalyptic event, and Brad is now a middle-aged man crushed by an all-consuming guilt and self-loathing, blaming himself for not being able to stop it and for Lisa's eventual suicide. Perhaps this explains his passion for martial arts, and his pre-apocalypse profession of dojo master, teaching self-defense techniques to children. After a brief introductory flashback scene, our story picks up when Brad stumbles across a baby girl in the wasteland and adopts her as his daughter, naming her Buddy. To Brad, this is a heaven-sent second chance to care for somebody vulnerable and keep them safe from harm, an opportunity to atone for what he sees as his past failures. If you've played The Last of Us, then you've heard this one before. The wordless montage that shows Buddy growing up and Brad unsuccessfully attempting to kick his joy habit is quite touching and incredibly economical in how quickly it establishes the complicated relationship between these two characters. While Brad is ostensibly well-meaning in his overbearing sheltering of Buddy to protect her from those outside who would abuse her, he is most definitely guilty of using her himself as a prop in his own internal psychodrama. You might reasonably say that this is by far the lesser of two evils, but since this stifling existence is the only one that Buddy has ever known, she quite understandably resents Brad for her effective imprisonment. Before this simmering tension is able to come to a head, the matter is settled when Brad returns from a joy binge to find the house raided and Buddy kidnapped, giving us our inciting incident and our main goal of rescuing Buddy. Before digging into the gameplay, I think a few words are necessary on the idiosyncratic humour of Lisa, which runs through the game as a relieving undercurrent to provide regular breaks from the overwhelming bleakness. It's often the case that darker topics tend to inspire comedy in those familiar with them. I suppose because those who know just how nasty the world can be need to have a sense of humour about it to avoid being crushed by the unfairness of it all. Our introduction to this side of Lisa comes immediately after the intro montage, when Brad meets the ever-informative Terry Hintz, the man who just can't get enough of tutorials. As the first party member and companion the player recruits, part of the joke here is that Terry is very likeable and quite funny, but utterly useless in combat. Much of the humour in Lisa comes from the unusual NPC designs and personalities, perhaps because they've been driven mad with despair, but there are gags aplenty as you explore and travel through the world. Anytime the game isn't trying to piss you off or make you feel depressed, it's probably trying to make you laugh, or quite possibly all three of these at once. Explaining a joke is the fastest way to make it unfunny, so I won't linger on this topic, but suffice to say that while it doesn't always get a chuckle, the humour of Lisa is consistent in tone, and quite frequently the joke is at the player's expense, deliberately inconveniencing them or tricking them with something unexpected. As you'll see over the rest of this video, that's going to become something of a theme in Lisa, and the player's response would land somewhere on the spectrum between laughing along with the game or getting annoyed and switching it off. Perhaps more than anything else, your attitude towards this will be the deciding factor in whether or not you have the willpower to see Lisa through to the end over multiple sessions. So, returning to the prologue where the gameplay really begins, as you make your way through the introductory area, you'll get a pretty good idea of what the rest of the game is going to look like. A lot of your time is going to be taken up by laborious, grid-based traversal that doesn't leave any room for expression or depth of movement. This ain't no platformer. If you walk off too high a ledge, you take damage. If you accidentally fall off screen, it's an instant game over. Navigating the world in this slow, plodding way gets tedious very quickly, especially when there are multiple paths forward and you have to do some backtracking to figure out where to go. Later on, when you get a bicycle and can move more quickly, this tiresome traversal becomes marginally more bearable, but it also becomes much easier to accidentally rush off a ledge by mistake and watch 20 minutes of progress evaporate before your eyes. This boring yet overly punishing movement is just one of many hostile design decisions in Lisa the Painful that make you feel certain that the game is having a laugh at your expense, and I'll speak about that trend more broadly when we've seen a bit more of it. For now, let's move on to party members and combat. As you're walking or very carefully cycling around the place, you'll regularly find yourself dragged into combat, usually signposted in advance by the enemy waiting for you to walk into them, but occasionally dropped on you in an ambush, or rarely as a random encounter in certain dark caves. Combat starts off quite simple when it's just Brad and one or two weak allies, and mostly revolves around choosing the right skill from the move list for the job, then inputting the button combination for it. New party members can be found and recruited as you explore, and they usually want something from you in return, like a short side quest to bring them an item, or just a hefty pile of magazines as their sign-up fee. That last one is overused a bit too much if you ask me, and it means that a lot of tedious grinding for currency is necessary if you want to recruit everyone you meet. But this is another bit of hostile design that you can easily spin as intentional if you so desire. Once you've recruited more party members than you can have following you at once, things start to get a bit more interesting, as you have to begin making choices about whose skills and abilities you want to prioritize and which ones you think will work together best. In combat, there's a frankly ludicrous number of different status ailments, some of which admittedly do the same thing, but still you've got quite a lot of freedom in strategizing how to best exploit their effects, like, say, drenching an enemy in gasoline before lighting them on fire. My own tactic was to focus on a group stun from Brad that knocked enemies to their feet and hopefully cost them their turn, before stacking poison, burn and bleed effects from my other members to pull the plug on the enemy health pool and let a big chunk of it drain away on every turn. A few high damage nuke attacks would fill in the gaps while I was waiting. As enemies are quite liberal with dishing out status ailments of their own on your party, I found it was essential to disable them early with stuns and keep them missing turns as often as possible. If one of your guys gets paralysed or succumbs to fear, then it can be quite debilitating having a turn without them, or worse, wasting everyone else's turn on curing them and restoring their health. This is especially true in a big group fight with tons of enemies that can wail on you at once, and it's even more especially true if it's your healer getting stunned. In keeping with Lisa's unforgiving nature, allies with useful healing abilities are relatively few and far between, so when I eventually came across one that could heal the whole squad, it was an uncharacteristically pleasant surprise and he became a permanent member of the team. An altogether less pleasant surprise was the discovery that some bosses and mini-bosses can occasionally make use of a devastating instant kill attack that immediately takes out one of your party members. Not knocking them out in a state they can be revived from, no, these moves will outright kill a party member dead, breaking their neck and erasing them from existence. Needless to say, like so much else in this game, this is an incredibly punishing and more or less random occurrence that will almost certainly make you want to quit and reload immediately. This brings me back yet again to the hostile design of Lisa that doesn't care about wasting your time. I told you that would be a running theme here. Before I grab this by the horns and get into what that really means though, if indeed it means anything at all, I want to make a few points about how resources work in Lisa. One thing you'll find yourself doing a lot in a playthrough is picking up items, consumables, weapons, armor, and other assorted equipment to fill up your inventory screen, with pretty much all of these only being relevant to combat. Equipping your party with the gear that best supports your strategy for combat is straightforward enough and offers a bit of depth, but if, like me, you're infected with min-max optimization disease and would die and restart before even thinking about using a consumable item in an RPG, then you won't get much out of the variety of healing and status curing items. This is a shame because there's one class of item that has quite an interesting wrinkle to it. One of the more common things you can find lying around is bottles, which the player can fill up with healing soup, status curing water, status harming dirty water, and flammable gasoline, all of which can be used in battle for various effects. Or you can just chuck empty ones at enemies' heads for a healthy chunk of damage. I'm a big fan of mechanics that force the player to make choices with a limited resource that has multiple potential uses, so this idea gets a thumbs up from me in theory, but in practice I almost never made use of any of these options because of my aforementioned min-max disorder. The main exception here was in the finale, where you're given a couple dozen firebombs just beforehand and more or less instructed to go buck wild with them. The hoarding of resources is further encouraged by the fact that you always have the option of restoring your health and curing status ailments by going back to a hub and resting at a campfire for free. Except it's not really free because every time you rest like this, you're risking a random event ruining your sleep, like a spider skittering away and leaving you to wake up poisoned, or part of your inventory being stolen in the night. This means that trying to be clever by avoiding using resources unnecessarily will sometimes result in you losing resources anyway, with a nugget of wasted time added on top for good measure. Which, is fair enough for this game and is a pretty funny trick all told, but because it's random and not guaranteed, it's still worth taking the time to return to these campfires. Of course, you could easily label this as just another way that Lisa intentionally revels in wasting your time with hostile design. But in this case, I think it's a little harder to spin as deliberate, because the safe refuge that these campfires provide, even slightly risky as it is, makes the game more forgiving, not less. One camping tent near the first hub area gives you a permanent stat loss the first time you wake up there, which is a particularly Lisa-like twist of the knife, but after that it never happens again, and this becomes a secure place to rest and heal. For the sake of my sanity, part of me is glad that this is the case, but I can't help feeling that this concession might be a bit too lenient on the player for a game that's supposed to be all about pain. I'm itching to make a comparison to Fear and Hunger here, another grueling game remarkable for its utter indifference to the player, but I realised while writing this script that there are quite a lot of fruitful contrasts to be made there, so I'll bunch them all together later on. Sticking with the subject of Lisa being a bit too lenient on the player, something else I need to get into is the way the drug Joy works. Using it will temporarily increase a character's stats and make crits dramatically more likely in combat, but it's a very limited resource, with only a handful of pills found over the course of a playthrough. On top of that, when it wears off, you're left with the status element of Joy Withdrawal, which turns most party members into a feeble liability incapable of dealing any damage at all. Characters who were addicts before the events of the game, Brad included, will suffer these withdrawal symptoms regardless of whether the player actually uses Joy or not. So far, so good. All of this makes sense and is quite fitting for the theme of the game. But what doesn't sit quite right with me, and what definitely doesn't make sense, is that resting at a campfire removes the status element of Joy Withdrawal for a time, making it way too easy to ignore the negative effects of avoiding Joy use. So many of the questionable design choices in Lisa can be hand-waved aside or excused as intentional attempts at frustrating the player, And I promise I'm getting to that, I really am. But in this case, the ease with which the player is able to ignore joy withdrawal is something that I feel quite comfortable criticising as a genuine flaw that undermines the core of what Lisa is all about. Far be it from me to ask for the famously unforgiving and hostile game to be even more brutal in its unforgivingness, but I think the developer missed a trick here. I can see a lot of ways this addiction mechanic could have given the player more difficult choices to make and pulled them into the world a bit more. If resting didn't remove withdrawal symptoms, and Brad was permanently nerfed until you took some joy, it could have presented the player with a sort of natural difficulty selection, making them choose between the more difficult route of avoiding addiction or giving in to allow themselves a more painless time. Party members who were addicted could leave you if you went too long without giving them their fix, or even get into conflict with you for holding out on them. A change like this would add a lot more urgency to the game too. With joy being a strictly limited resource, the player would feel some pressure to keep up the pace so that they could keep finding more before running out. As the game works now, it makes zero difference whether the player uses joy or not, and I can't ignore that this feels like a huge spot of missed potential. But, as with so many facets of this game, once again you could spin this to say that that's the whole point. Sometimes it doesn't matter what you do in the present. Nothing can change the past and the effect it's had on you. It's not a particularly nice thing to think about, but sometimes it's true. Whether you choose to give Brad more joy or not, it makes no difference at all because he's already way too far gone and is well beyond saving. In a way, this goes against the standard ethos of games as a medium, where the bare minimum a player might expect is that their actions or choices have some consequences. But Lisa is quite obviously a game that's not shy about subverting expectations. Whether or not you think this makes Lisa succeed as a game, part of the point of subverting expectations is to inspire discussions exactly like the parasocial one we're having right now. And at least in that respect, if in nothing else, Lisa is an unequivocal success. Now I've danced around it for long enough, so I think the time has come to really dig into the consequences of what I've so far been calling the hostile design of Lisa. But first let me drop a few more examples to prove that I'm not just cherry picking here. The game really does revel in wasting your time, either by making you repeat the same thing over and over, or by doing something downright unfair and then daring you to reload and try again for a better result. Firstly, when you reach a new hub area and rest, there's a chance that one of your party members will be kidnapped for a ransom fee. Right off the bat, if you don't know where to find the hideout of the gang responsible, then you could waste a lot of time just backtracking while looking for it. If you don't have 100 magazines to buy their freedom, a substantial sum, then what do? You grind the same invisible enemy over and over again in one of the 2 caves in the game that feature random encounters, getting 10 mags at a time until you have enough. Even if you do have the mags to rescue your ally, the option of grinding is an ever-present one that can solve basically any currency-related question, at the simple cost of some of your time being wasted. When these guys stop you on your way out of a settlement and demand all your mags or they'll kill everyone inside, the obvious solution is to give them what they want and then grind to get it back. When the game asks you these questions about how much you value the lives of NPCs, it honestly falls kind of flat when there's an obvious way to have your cake and eat it, however tedious it may be. You can rescue your ally, save the town, and buy everything you want from the merchant. All you have to do is waste 20 minutes of your life in this cave. If grinding wasn't an option, then there really would be difficult choices to make here. But because grinding is an option, then the only choice you need to make is deciding how much you respect your own time. Another great example of this comes right at the end of the prologue, when you're forced to make a choice between the life of Terry, a useless companion but your only friend so far, or handing over your entire inventory. Given that this is right at the start of the game, it's easy enough to let your small inventory go for the sake of saving the life of your only ally, and I think most people will do that, but crafty players might see a way around this apparent dilemma if they know it's coming. If you avoid picking anything up before reaching this junction, then you can give up an empty inventory in return for Terry's life, then walk all the way back to the start and grab the items you purposefully missed on your way down. You get the best of both worlds, and as in my previous examples, you lose nothing but your time. Now you might say that playing this way isn't really in the spirit of the game, and I'd be inclined to agree. But I would also say that it's the developer's responsibility to put boundaries in place that stop the player from cheating like this and force them to play in the spirit of the game. It would have been easy enough to do this by just blocking the way back after the choice with Terry. If you want your players to suffer the pain of making an impossible choice, then don't allow them the satisfaction of finding a tedious way around it. Or if you want to go even further with it, punish them for even trying. Then again, perhaps your punishment for breaking the rules like this is simply the tedium you experience in doing so. One final example, because it really is the ultimate specimen of Lisa disrespecting the player's time. When transitioning from the game's first crossroads hub to the second, you get put through a Russian roulette minigame, where you have to pick which of your allies' lives to risk across 3 rounds, with what I think is a roughly 50% chance of each one losing and dying for good. You have to win 3 times to proceed, so if you lose a round, then your ally is simply dead with nothing to show for it. With all this being entirely dependent on chance, you can see how it might become a frustrating experience, especially knowing that you can reload and try again if you don't like the results. I was lucky enough to only lose 2 characters on my first pass through, and obviously I picked the ones I was least bothered about losing, so I just considered myself lucky and continued on my way. But again, since the results of this section are completely based on RNG, the spectrum of what's possible ranges from getting through completely unscathed to losing every single party member and getting a game over. As in my examples before, any player who's willing to give up enough of their day to keep reloading a save and rolling the dice until they get a favourable result can get through this section with no trouble, and without actually sacrificing anything of importance, besides, their precious time on this earth. Once again, you can avoid having to make any difficult decisions through the application of tedious busy work. Now, with all those examples out of the way, here is where I finally reach something of a crossroads myself in my discussion of Lisa, because there are a couple of ways you can interpret its hostile and deliberately unfun design. It would be all too easy to point towards the boring movement, tedious grinding, unforgiving insta-kill boss attacks, and indifferent luck-based bottlenecks, and simply chalk it all up to bad or poorly considered design. Maybe the developer had no idea what he was doing and just did a bad job. In almost any other game, the uncharitable analysis might stop right there. But in Lisa, the game that explicitly describes itself as a painful experience, the frustrating toil that it forces you through takes on a whole new form and starts to look intentional. The game wants you to feel its hostility towards you, and sure enough, I didn't exactly look forward to my play sessions with Lisa. I almost had to force myself to pick it up each time. It makes sense that a game all about pain should be painful to play, but of course once you start down this path of excusing frustrating the player as a purposeful choice, there's very little criticism that can't be brushed aside by just saying, "Don't you see? That's the point. It's supposed to feel bad." To which I would reply, yes, it does feel bad. But the crucial follow-up question here is, does it feel bad in a way that's interesting? If I want to be bored, there are faster and cheaper ways to do it than by playing a tedious and unfair game. There's plenty of paint drying out there for those who know where to look for it. So now we have to ask, what exactly does pain mean to Lisa the Painful? Handily, the game comes with a baked-in answer to this question, in an option you're given right at the beginning to enable pain mode, with fair warning given that you're about to make your life a lot harder if you proceed. In actual fact, pain mode changes very little about the game. A small number of enemy encounters are made more difficult, exactly 5 if the bullet points on the wiki are an exhaustive list, and a new secret area becomes available that sheds some light on the setting. But by far the most impactful difference that the player cannot fail to notice is that in pain mode, each save point can only be used once before disappearing. As I'm sure you can imagine, with fewer opportunities to save, the distance between saves is made considerably lengthier, and you're at risk of losing a lot more progress anytime you mess up and die, which, as I hope I've demonstrated adequately by now, is only sometimes the player's fault, and is sometimes just the game playing a trick on you. I tried enabling pain mode on my first playthrough before quickly realising what a horrible mistake I'd made and starting again without it. I could see it being a bit more bearable on a second playthrough when you have some advanced knowledge of what's coming and which order to visit places, but you're still likely to make a few mistakes and waste a fair amount of time unless you have a guide at the ready, which I wouldn't normally encourage, but in this case I think it's justified. Only, once you've broken your pact with the game and resorted to outside help like that, you might as well just save yourself the time and read about the differences on the wiki instead. All of this is to say that pain mode doesn't make the game more challenging or interesting for the player. It only makes it more tedious, and anybody who even remotely respects their own time is better off steering well clear. So just to summarise, in a game which is all about pain, there's an option to enable pain mode, which you would think has some claim to being the definitive experience in a game which is all about pain. But the most notable difference that it causes is simply that it makes the game more of a tiresome chore to play. I think this tells you a lot about what Lisa and its developer consider to be a painful experience, and in case it isn't clear by now, I'm not convinced they have it right. Where it claims to offer pain, for the majority of its runtime, what Lisa actually offers is mild irritation and inconvenience. You can substitute almost every instance of the words pain and suffering in this video for boredom or tedium, and it will still be accurate. Now again, you can say that this is intentional, and I mean, it certainly gets the point across that life isn't always fun. In the medium of games where pleasure seeking is so frequently the unchallenged norm, asking the player to willingly sit through the exact opposite of that is a clear and unmissable statement that this needn't be the case. But by equating pain with frustrating gameplay, Lisa misses out on a whole spectrum of human emotion that also comes under the category of pain. And, to be quite honest, the whole deliberately inconveniencing the player shtick gets a bit old over 12 hours and kind of stops being funny before you reach the end. I've already mentioned several other parts of the game that could have offered some decisions for the player to make that are more painful than, do I want to keep playing this tedious game? If you were forced to make a real and lasting choice between spending mags on saving an ally, or sparing a town of NPCs, or buying better gear for your party, it would be a meaningful decision that might cause the player some pain as they went forward, second-guessing themselves and doubting whether they made the right call or not. Or how about choosing between giving into joy addiction for an easier time or toughing through the slog of going without it? That would be a genuine dilemma that the player might agonize over. These are painful decisions that are so close to being in the game, and yet in both cases the player can worm their way out of them by sitting through a few minutes of grinding or repetitive tedium. Being forced to do the same thing over and over again and having your time wasted is certainly a frustrating and dejecting experience, and you wouldn't be wrong to call it painful too. But I can't stop myself from thinking, is this really the best we can do? Make the player have a bad time on purpose by removing all quality of life features, with monotony and boredom making up the main facets of a so-called painful experience? I'll leave that question to linger for a while as I begin to tie up the threads of my thoughts on Lisa, starting with the narrative. Now, when you play any game, you don't want to be bored, and obviously Lisa and its developer know that. So when this game deliberately bores and frustrates you, it's asking you how much suffering, or boredom, you can stand in service of a higher purpose, namely the goal of seeing the story advance to its conclusion. To that end, Lisa most definitely does want you to develop an emotional investment in the characters and story, and it's more or less essential if you're going to be willfully banging your head against the wall for several hours before you see any kind of payoff. So what does that story look like, and how is the player asked to take part in it? After being given the goal of rescuing Buddy in the prologue, you progress from hub area to hub area, and at the transition between each of these crossroads, you're stopped and forced to make a choice between being mutilated, that is, losing an arm, or having party members permanently killed. To the game's credit, these dilemmas are not so easily breakable as the others I've been criticizing so far. There's no grinding or save scumming your way out of these ones. You actually, finally, have to make a decision with lasting consequences, as losing an arm, or both, will make Brad less effective in combat and remove some of his combo skills. I chose to give up an arm both times, and to be honest, I didn't find that being armless made the game substantially harder, but that might be because as I progressed I leveled up into the gap left behind by the missing limbs, or just got better at using my party's abilities. In any case, I think the developer could have pushed a little bit harder on this to make the choice of losing an arm more impactful. Later you're given a similar choice, this time with Buddy's nipple on the line, which did succeed in making me pause and think for a while. It's clear enough what Brad would choose in this situation, and I originally went with that as well, until the game guilted me into changing my mind. But believe it or not, the status of Buddy's nipple has zero impact on gameplay and is never mentioned again after this either way, so while this quandary may be shocking initially, in hindsight choosing to keep your party alive is kind of a no-brainer here. Any attachment you feel to your allies will most likely be one of convenience for the abilities they provide you with in combat, with the possible exception of Terry, but there are a few sweet or humorous scenes that take place around campfires that can flesh them out a bit whenever you rest. As Brad chases after Buddy, she makes no secret of the fact that she doesn't want to be rescued, least of all by the man she still resents for keeping her imprisoned her entire life. Eventually, Brad abandons his party in the night and proceeds to the island where Buddy has fled to, only to find that she shares the island with who else but Marty, Brad and Lisa's abusive father and the ultimate cause of Brad's life trajectory up to this point. On discovering this, the player is given a choice between killing Marty, who claims he's changed, or forgiving him, though in actual fact this choice is false, and Brad will kill him in a rage whatever you pick. This is not a complaint, as it's clearly a deliberate design decision. Even if Brad makes an attempt to forgive Marty at the player's direction, he's utterly unable to do so, and will never be able to resist the rage telling him to make mincemeat out of his father. This is well in keeping with the recurrent theme of the series that some scars never heal, and that your past misfortunes will always have a hold over your present decisions. Clearly disgusted and terrified by the slaughter dished out by Brad, Buddy flees one last time, and Brad follows her into the finale of Lisa the Painful. Coming up against an army of gang members, Brad remains totally unfazed in his conviction that being responsible for Buddy is the cause he wants to either live or die for, whether she likes it or not. Even when his former party members show up and try to stop him, he doesn't waver and cuts them down before dispatching with wave after wave of goons, and eventually the gang leader that stands between him and Buddy. Riddled with arrows and lacerated into ribbons, Brad is able to shuffle over to Buddy and spend his dying moments attempting to resolve the tension between them. As the player, you get to choose whether Buddy gives him one last hug or not. His final question, "Did I do the right thing?" is left unanswered as the credits roll. In a post-credits sequence, we control Brad fully transfigured into a joy-mutated flesh monster as he inches his way towards the hut where Buddy is sleeping, and then the game ends for real this time. Brad's transformation here, as all his trauma catches up to him, feels as inevitable and well-earned as anything else in the world of Lisa, but I have to say that I think it might have hit harder if it had come before, during the combat gameplay of the finale, rather than as an epilogue. Buddy's choice of whether or not to hug him might have been even more grotesque and symbolic if that was the case, and it would also have been a bit more believable that an armless man could defeat an entire crowd of enemies. All that aside though, this conclusion is a fitting one that brings Brad's tale to a sympathetic close. Almost every decision made and action undertaken by him in this story can be interpreted as a response to the trauma he's carried with him since childhood. Not only in his reaction to encountering Marty again, but in his overprotectiveness of Buddy and his single-minded obsession with getting her back at all costs. Clearly, more than anything else, this theme of carrying your burdens with you forever is the overriding theme of the Lisa saga. We saw it in the previous game, and we'll see it in the next one too. There's plenty that I've left out of my discussion of Lisa the Painful's story, characters and side plots that flesh out the world and the web of relationships in the game's cast. In the interest of time, I'm skipping over all of that because A, much of it is only hinted at rather than explicitly told, and a trip to the wiki after playing is pretty much required to get the specifics, and B, I see all of this stuff as firmly secondary to the more evident drama playing out between Buddy and Brad, one of whom is the player's avatar after all. The third and final chapter of this series, Lisa the Joyful, is mostly about tying up the loose threads left fraying at the end of the Painful. That is to say, killing all the characters off and letting Buddy's story come to its grim conclusion. If you checked the scroll bar lately, then you already know that I don't have a huge amount to say about the Joyful that I haven't already covered elsewhere in this video. In terms of gameplay, it's mostly the same as before. You explore areas from a central hub, picking up consumables and new gear, and fighting enemies and bosses. The biggest difference here is the lack of a party system, as Buddy obviously doesn't trust anybody. Only Rando joins you for a while at the start before Buddy spends most of the game alone. While combat with Brad was mostly about picking the right combo and working out synergies between party members, fighting as Buddy revolves around getting the timing down for certain high damage skills. Once you can do that consistently, every fight looks more or less the same. On top of that, Buddy has a skill that allows her to heal herself for free, making her infinitely more capable than Brad, and making Lisa the Joyful into a mostly pain-free experience, at least when it comes to gameplay. All of this means that this final game in the series is quite easy, and I think it's safe to say that it's more concerned with providing a bit of closure than with frustrating or challenging the player. As for what that closure looks like, the story picks up pretty much exactly where the previous one left off. Teaming up with her reluctant half-brother Rando, Buddy makes her way around the remnants of the wasteland, killing every gang leader of note, to leave room for only herself at the top of the doomed heap that is the land of Olathe. If we run with the theme of this series so far, and assume that, just like Brad, Buddy's life and motivations have been irrevocably shaped by the unfortunate circumstances of her early years, then I think we can go some way towards explaining her compulsion to remove any trace of organised groups around her. As far as anyone knows, Buddy is the only female anywhere in Olathe, a fact that she was no doubt constantly reminded of by Brad as his excuse for her confinement, and while she understands how important she is because of this, she despises the way it turns her into an object, either to be used or to be protected. Every other character in the story is guilty of treating her that way, Brad perhaps most selfishly of all, using her as a surrogate to make up for his own past failures. Anytime anybody mentions wanting to protect Buddy or keep her safe, it triggers her resentment of living a life that never was and can never truly be her own, and her reaction is invariably negative. To cut a DLC-length story short, Buddy ends up killing pretty much every other human character, both those who want to hurt her and those who want to help her, and the player is ultimately left with the choice of whether or not she takes a joy vaccine or lets herself become a mutant like everyone else. Whichever of these endings you pick, my interpretation is that humanity is doomed either way, but it's left open enough that the more optimistically minded can read some hope into it if they so desire. Given everything that's happened up to now, however, a happy ending doesn't feel quite right to me. A far more appropriate ending for Lisa is that the ceaseless cycle of inherited trauma eventually leads to the end of the world, and that's how I choose to read it. Now, speaking of never-ending trauma, I promised you a comparison with Fear and Hunger, and that's what I'm going to give you before wrapping things up with my conclusion. The Fear and Hunger games, of which there are two, share a few things in common with Lisa, not least of which is a carefree willingness to waste the player's time, but I think they come at the idea from a slightly different angle which is worth exploring here. This is another series created by a single developer in RPG Maker, and he also isn't afraid to frustrate the player and bombard them with disturbing and troubling imagery. Just like Lisa, on the surface, Fear and Hunger certainly has the appearance of a traditional RPG. It's got health points, an equipment screen, turn-based combat, even something like a party system for the rare occasion when allies join you. Perhaps where it differs most from your average RPG, however, and from Lisa as well, is that there's no XP or leveling to speak of. You rarely gain anything from fighting enemies, and combined with the absolutely brutal and unforgiving nature of combat, this means that Fear and Hunger is an RPG where a sensible course of action, and very often the only viable one, is to run away from every single enemy you come across, which I think is quite a subversive take on the genre. And when I say combat is brutal and unforgiving, what I mean is that the first enemy in the game can cut your arm off in a single attack, and it's just gone for the rest of the playthrough, assuming you don't immediately die from a second hit or succumb to bleeding a few steps later, which you probably will. Funnily enough, this provides me with a good first point of comparison with Lisa. In that game, when you lose a limb, it comes as part of a big crossroad moment presented to you as a grand choice that the player has to make. In Fear and Hunger, you can lose a limb at any time and without fanfare, simply by accident of bumping into the wrong enemy. It's not a choice or dilemma to agonize over, it's just a big fuck you for daring to exist in this world. The universe doesn't owe you a pair of arms, and it can take as freely as it gives. It may not necessarily be fun when a single misstep or a bad coin toss can spell mutilation and death, but that's life. Whether or not you want the games you play to remind you of that fact is something that's up to you. In one of this game's funniest and cruelest jokes at the player's expense, your curiosity for poking around in every hole you find is directly and purposefully punished if you ignore every warning and choose to climb inside this toilet, only to find yourself soft-locked and forced to quit and restart. It's certainly a more disgusting rendition of Lisa's long rope climbs, but I think it also hits in a slightly different way. In Lisa, you're climbing a rope like any other in the game, and for all you know, there might be something important at the top. When it turns out there isn't, it's a trick the game has played on you. In Fear and Hunger, if you choose to climb inside a toilet hole despite being warned about how pointless and revolting it is, then you only have yourself to blame for the inevitably runny and squelchy results. With all I've mentioned so far, I think Fear and Hunger actually does a better job at making the player feel the game's utter indifference towards them than Lisa does, but it's still weighed down by its fair share of tedium, which, as always, you could say is a deliberate part of that indifference. You'll be restarting this game a lot, and every time you do, you'll have to search again through every barrel and crate you come across for the food and occasional healing items that are randomly found inside. In a rare display of mercy, the game does allow you to save by resting in a bed, but this doesn't heal you and is totally dependent on winning a coin flip, with potentially disastrous results for failure. Without wanting to get too deep into it, I'm surprised the developer made this concession, because however inconvenient it may be, being able to save removes a significant amount of tension and stress from the player when they have the option of reloading and trying again if things don't go their way. Still, the hostility of this save mechanic nevertheless makes it a departure from Lisa, which gives you a safe zone that can be used indefinitely for free healing, and I would even say that the leniency shown here by Lisa reveals a gap in the cloak of indifference that it wants to hide behind. Despite its self-description as a painful experience, Lisa is a game that does want you to get invested enough to finish it and see it through to the end. Fear and Hunger, on the other hand, doesn't give a single fuck what you choose to do, or for that matter, how I choose to critique it, and it couldn't care less about whether you make it to the end of the first level, let alone the end of the game. It doesn't care about getting you invested in any kind of story or characters, and it has countless secrets and unexpected events that the majority of players will almost certainly never see. While you have to respect the single-minded devotion to this core principle of masochistic indifference, it's a devotion that sort of prevents Fear and Hunger from being about anything else alongside it, unlike Lisa, which doesn't commit quite so hard to its uncaring attitude, and as a result is able to have an actual narrative you might come to be invested in. Perhaps all this is why I have finished Lisa, but I've never reached the end of Fear and Chungus despite picking it up a few times, and I highly doubt I ever will. But then, I don't think you necessarily need to finish it to get the point like you do with Lisa. Did I have fun playing Fear and Hunger? Abso-fucking-lutely not. Do I think it was a worthwhile and unforgettable experience that enriched my conception of what games can do? Yes. This game is hard to play, not because it's difficult, but because it's actually hard to force yourself through the painful slog of deliberately hostile design choices. In a game that didn't make its sadistic intent so obvious, you might be tempted to call this bad or unbalanced design, but the toil the game forces you through takes on a whole new quality when it's presented in this pitiless way. Freed from the burden of needing to be completable or comprehensible, Fear and Hunger delivers on the concept of an indifferent world in a way that Lisa isn't quite able to, and it's a must-play in the field of games beyond simple entertainment. At least for those who have the stomach for it and the patience to endure plenty of repetition and tedium. Just don't expect to get to the end before either of those runs out. So what are we to make of these games that go out of their way to turn the act of playing them into an unpleasant experience? At a glance, it seems like they make a mockery of the most basic of game design principles, that a game should be fun to play. And for that reason, I think it's surely no coincidence that both Lisa and the Fear and Hunger series were both made by single individuals, without the oversight of a committee or marketing team pleading with them to lighten the tone a little. In this way, these games are very pure and strongly curated experiences, and you can guarantee that every single thing you see or do in them lines up in some way to how their authors see the world. The world that these creators see when they look out is a dark and uncaring one, where not everything is fun all the time, and they've attempted to reflect that vision in their work, to the unquestionable benefit, if not always the enjoyment, of the medium. Slogging through the same fights, grinding for currency, and skipping through the same dialogue over and over again can't be called fun by any stretch of the imagination. Neither can a random NPC who explodes when interacted with and reduces your whole party to 1 HP. But as the player, you can choose to either laugh at the inconvenience and see it for the joke that it so clearly is, or you can get annoyed that your time is being wasted and your next hit of dopamine is being delayed. Your patience for this kind of thing, and your willingness to sit through a dozen hours of it, is the thing that will make or break your tolerance of Lisa. But I mean, you have to wonder, is a more hedonistic but no less idle experience like, say, playing Overwatch or Fortnite really more fulfilling than spending 12 hours of your life with Lisa? If one looks like a waste of time to you and the other doesn't, then this is your invitation to think about why. One thing I can say in Lisa's defense here is that at least it has an ending and doesn't want to keep you trapped inside it forever. I'm sure those more obliging, pleasure-seeking games have a more analgesic effect than playing Lisa, but in that respect, they're not unlike the drug joy. Indulging in it may dull the horror and pain of existence for a short time, but don't forget that it also turns you into a mindless monster. Whether that meta-commentary was intended by Lisa's developer on the numbing and anodyne nature that so many games gravitate towards, I think it's there for the player to read into it if they choose. And in any case, making a game that so deliberately goes against the pursuit of pleasure is an obvious statement that he felt the medium was missing something like it. And yet, by billing itself as a painful experience, I think Lisa sets up an expectation that it's not quite able to cash in on, due to the simple fact that pain means more, or is supposed to mean more, than just the absence of pleasure. The barrage of inconveniences that Lisa throws at you can be irritating, and they certainly make the game less fun to play, but because they almost never have any lasting consequences, can they really be said to be painful, or are they just mild annoyances? If the goal is to use the interactive medium to make the player feel negative emotions, I can think of plenty of examples that do so without resorting to being deliberately boring. If you've felt the bittersweet mixture of relief, guilt, and dread that comes from slaying a colossus that was just minding its own business, then you know what I'm talking about. It's only in the last couple of hours that Lisa is able to pull this kind of emotional tapestry together, mostly in the form of narrative payoff, and I wish it had been able to bake a little more of that into the gameplay throughout. If I come across as overly harsh towards Lisa in this video, then that's not my intention. It may have plenty of flaws, both deliberate and accidental, but it nevertheless gives the player a mostly cohesive experience of unrelenting despair, punctuated with cathartic humour, and tells a story about people hurting each other that dives far deeper into the darkness, cruelty, and pity of humanity than your average violent game. Lisa stands out as a prominent example of a game that subverted the usual expectations of the medium and asked players to question whether they were open to more than simple entertainment. Whether it will still have that prominence 10 or 20 or 50 years from now is impossible to say, but perhaps more important than the markets left on the medium is the one that it leaves on the people who have experienced it. Playing Lisa was a frustrating, aggravating, and yes, sometimes painful experience, but it's one that I'll be thinking about for a long time. How many hero looter shooters can you say that about? I want to leave you with a recap of one small section of gameplay that perfectly caps off the interactive side of Lisa and reaffirms the philosophy behind it, in this game's typically sardonic but still quite touching fashion. In the final chapter, right at the furthest edge of the explorable world, you can find another one of those ludicrously long ropes, this one taking around 40 seconds to climb. But if you thought you knew what would be at the top, this time you're wrong. This time it leads to a mountain path that zigzags higher and higher, a location not so different from others in the game that might make you forget about the massive rope you just climbed to get here and what usually awaits at the end of one. And at the top of that mountain you'll find a heartfelt letter from the developer thanking you for playing and for giving him the chance to create something that resonates with people and makes them feel things that the average game doesn't. Then you head to the next screen and there you go. Somehow I didn't see this coming. I can't believe I fell for this trick, but I'm glad I did. Firstly, I got a chuckle out of it, but also a very welcome moment of contemplation, as the surprise of seeing this middle finger again cut right through the warm fuzzy feeling that still lingered from the letter I was just reading. and the juxtaposition of these two sensations really encapsulates another of the themes that I think runs throughout all of Lisa. The indifference of the universe to your struggles and woes is a given, and that will never change. But the things you feel and the moments you share with others along the way are real, for better or for worse. When the darker beasts of human behaviour are set free, those moments can destroy someone's life forever. And yet somehow, even submerged in that unfathomable darkness, we can share that pain with each other and we can laugh at it together, because what else can we do? No matter how high you climb, the universe looks on with its middle finger raised.